Good morning, happy Thursday. Today is July 30th, 2020. I hope you all are happy, healthy, and living the best life you possibly can. My name is Carol White, and I would like to welcome you to this week's episode of When Life Needs a Detox. I am so glad you could make it, and I am going to jump right into today's topic because it may take longer than I'm thinking it will. I think it's short, but I get to talking, so it could go longer. Now, today's topic is racism in history, the three-fifth rule, myth and misrepresentation. The myth: during slavery, blacks were only considered three-fifths of a human being. This is a fallacy. The truth is that this piece of legislation was put into the Constitution as a way to keep the 1787 Constitutional Convention alive. The Southern states, the Democrats, wanted the slaves to count as people when it came to congressional representation, but to be counted as property when it came to taxation. The northern states, the Republicans, said you can either count slaves as people or you can count them as property, but you can't do both. This disagreement threatened the survival of the Constitutional Convention. So the following compromise was reached. It's Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. And it states, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, that means indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, three-fifths of all other persons. That gets a little cloudy and it gets a little hazy because they're doing the wherefores and the what ifs and the blah blah this and the blah blah that. All that flowery stuff when they should just say what they mean. And what is meant in truth by this article and this section is that the southern states could only use 60% of their slave numbers for congressional representation, and they could only be taxed on 60% of the slaves they owned. Now, another aspect to this article was that the southern states were prohibited from purchasing any more slaves until the year 1808, so as not to give the southern states an unfair advantage by padding their numbers. Now, this, I always have problems turning my pages, I'm sorry. This compromise kept the convention going, and it paved the way for future legislation favorable to both sides. Now, the three-fifth rule was repealed by the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, the 14th Amendment, which said that the representatives had to be apportioned by counting the whole number of persons in each state, and by the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the right to vote. But now you also have to understand with the 15th Amendment came the disenfranchising of blacks, meaning the southern states had all kinds of strategies to prohibit blacks from voting, to the property taxes that they had to pay, whether or not they own their own land, whether or not they were being held as an apprentice somewhere, or they were in jail and working off of debt. So we had that, but these three amendments repealed the 3/5 rule. So now you have to start asking yourself, how does something that's seemingly so straightforward get turned around and twisted to the point where you're saying these people are only 3/5 of a human being? Complete and total misinterpretation of the rule. If you do this strictly by math, you can only count 3/5 of your people. That's 60%. But somehow somebody looked at this and said, y'all were only 3/5 of a human being. We didn't even consider you completely human. That's why we were able to enslave you. That's a white supremacist mess. But also, you had teachers and scholars to look at this and say, oh, they only saw blacks as 3/5 of a human being. That's so terrible. Now, rather than going back and confirming their assertions, they simply took this right on over and started teaching this in systematic institutionalized education. Meaning, they went to school and they taught blacks and whites that slaves were only considered 3/5 of a human being. Now, this is during the 1900s, even part of the late 1800s, all through the 1900s. Even now, they are teaching this. And I couldn't believe it. I found it on a website called governmentandconstitution.org. It's called the 3/5 compromise for kids. And really it gives a very detailed synopsis of what the 3/5 compromise was and how it got to be where it is. But you get to a section in this called, let me make sure I got it, the 3/5 compromise, tax burden. Now it's reading, the 3/5 compromise was also used to determine what percentage of the nation's direct tax burden the state would have to bear. The 3/5 compromise is also referred to as the federal ratio. One slave will count for 3/5 of a free man when counting the population for seats in the state by state in the House. This is in writing. It's already listed in the references, but this is being listed. This is 2020. And you're still telling that bald-faced lie in schools that the 3/5 compromise determined that blacks were only 3/5 of a human being, and it is not true. But now you also have to figure, why would this be allowed to go on? I have a little theory based on what I have seen in the research that I've been doing for this series. Now, this particular misinterpretation fits perfectly as the precursor for the fallacy that the Civil War was fought to end slavery. And the misinterpretation of President Lincoln putting the Emancipation Proclamation into effect solely to battle the immorality of slavery. None of this was done on a morals basis, on a morality basis at all. The 3/5 clause was an agreement that was reached in order to keep the Constitutional Convention of 1787 alive. Remember, they're a brand new country. They got issues and complications. And I'm quite sure, and somewhere laying in the cut, England is trying to find ways to get their property back, because the colonies were theirs. So they might be looking to get their property back. It's only been gone for 12 years. Folks don't like to lose stuff. Not that way anyway. So in order to be a union, to stay as a union, as a United States, they had to make this compromise. So that's why the 3/5 rule was put into effect. The Civil War was not about the morality of slavery, but the economics of taking slaves into the West and doing all of the labor for free, putting white men out of jobs. And the Emancipation Proclamation, and we've talked about this before, was put into effect for two reasons. Number one, the abolitionists made it a hot political topic. And number two, it was a punitive act against the South because they wouldn't stop fighting. So if you take away their source of money, you take away their ability to fight in the long run. And again, I say, this is why we must be careful of who chronicles and interprets our history. Now, our history is not always going to be pretty, and it is not always going to make us proud. But our history makes us who we are, and being honest about our history can only make us stronger. When you start talking about the 3/5 rule, if you look at that, that wasn't a compromise. That was surrender. The Democrats didn't give one iota. They said, we want to count our slaves as people and property. The Republicans said, well, no, that's not fair. They said, we'll walk. We'll leave this Constitutional Convention, and we will leave you to handle all of this, but we won't be a part of it. Now, there's a essay, I've also included it in my references. It's written by Mike Rappaport, and it's called The Peculiarity of the 3/5 Rule. And he looks at this and just says, I don't see where there's a compromise. I see surrender. He says he can't see how it is the South compromised on anything, except that they accepted the percentages. But the South got exactly what they wanted. They were able to count slaves as people and as property. Because, the South never said that the slaves weren't people. They never said that. They said these people are property and they can't vote. But because they're people, we need to count them for representational purposes. They can't vote, but we need to count them in our numbers because they're people after all. So this also takes me back to never trust a politician or a political party because they are not doing anything in your best interest. As far as the southern states, the Democrats were concerned, we were a double asset. We could be counted on as property. They could do with us as they pleased. And they can also use us for numbers and representation. For the Republicans, we were a liability. We were a liability and we were a threat. We increased the numbers for the South, which means they would have a disproportionate advantage within the Congress. And that the Republicans did not want the Democrats to have. So understand this, and I'll say it again and again and again. There isn't a political party out here that cares one iota about the status of the Black community until it benefits them. I'm just saying. Well, that's all I have for today. I am so glad that you were able to join me. And if you weren't able to join me, I am so glad that you will be watching the replay. My name is Carol White. I am your life detox strategist. And this has been this week's episode of When Life Needs a Detox. I'm going to see you all next week on Thursday, 8 a.m. I'd love to see you there. I'd also love it if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel, Carol White, When Life Needs a Detox. Set it up so that you're notified when the broadcast is. You're notified for all replays. And on that note, again, thank you for joining me. I am going to see you next week. Do everything you can from now until then to live your absolute best life. I'll see ya. Bye-bye now.